There is an age that history forgot to name. You know the Stone Age and you know the Bronze Age, but between them lies a third, a quiet bridge of 1,000 years that almost no one remembers, and it was there that our whole world of metal began. Picture it now, a small thing gleaming in the palm of a hand, in the warm dark of a workshop, catching the low light of a fire and shining in a way that nothing in the world has ever shone before. Not stone, not bone, not wood, something new, dug from the grey rock as dull as any pebble, and then changed by fire and by knowing, into this bright and reddish thing that holds the firelight like a captured ember. It is a piece of copper, the first metal, and tonight you are going to step into the forgotten age it gave its name to, the Copper Age, the Chalcolithic, the age of copper and stone together. The books pass over it. They speak of the age of stone, and then of the age of bronze with its bright weapons and its first kings, as though the one became the other in a single step, and the long span between is left without a mention. But that span was the hinge on which everything turned. For here, after the working of stone had been mastered, and before bronze was ever found, human beings learned to do a thing they had never done before. They learned to reach into the grey rock and draw out metal, to transform the very substance of the world by fire. It was one of the great turning points in the whole human story, and it has been almost entirely forgotten. Tonight, you are going to remember it. To understand what metal changed, you must first see the world it changed, and it was not the wild world of the hunters, nor the empty world of the ice. By the time the first copper gleamed, human beings had already remade their lives more deeply than in all the ages before. They had learned to farm. They had learned to stay. They lived in villages that did not move, among fields they had cleared and sown, with flocks penned at the edge of their homes. The great change of settling down had already been made. Into that settled world, the world of the first farmers, the bright stone was about to be born. Picture that world as it stood, where once there had been only forest and open land. Now there were clearings, and in the clearings, villages. Houses of mud brick and timber, set close together, with hearths that burned in the same place year upon year. Around them lay the worked land, the fields of wheat and barley, golden in their season. Beyond the fields, the rough pasture where the sheep and goats and cattle grazed. Smoke rose from the rooftops. Paths ran from house to house and field to field. This was a tamed and ordered world, a world of people who had found their place and meant to keep it. The people of this world were farmers, and their lives turned on the slow wheel of the farming year. There was the breaking of the ground and the sowing of the seed. There was the long tending of the growing crop, the weeding and the watching. There was the harvest, when the whole village bent to the work of bringing in the grain. And there was the keeping of the beasts, the milking and the herding and the slaughter. It was a life of steady labour, sure and repeating, lived by the turning of the seasons rather than the wandering of the hunt. The food came from the field and the fold now, not from the wild. And because they farmed, they had something the old hunters never had in such measure. They had surplus, more food than the day required, grain that could be dried and stored in jars and pits against the hungry months, a wall of plenty, standing between the family and want. The storehouse was the heart of the settled life, and what it held was more than food. It was security. It was the freedom from the old, gnawing fear of hunger that had haunted humankind since the beginning. The people of this world could look at the coming year and feel, for the first time, something close to safe. The surplus did something else, something quieter and stranger. It freed hands. When a village could feed itself with food to spare, not every soul was needed in the fields every day. Some could turn to other work, to the making of pots, the weaving of cloth, the shaping of fine tools. The settled life had given people time and a place to use it, and so the crafts had grown rich and various. The village hummed with making, and some among the people had become makers above all. The first hint of the specialist, the person who does one thing and does it well, for this was already a world of made things, in a way the wandering world had never been. The houses were full of goods. There were pots of fired clay for the storing and cooking of food. There was cloth, spun and woven from wool and flax, for the clothing of the people. There were tools of polished stone, axes and adzes ground smooth and sharp. the finest stoneworking the human hand had ever achieved. The people of this settled world were surrounded by their own handiwork, the slow harvest of generations who had stayed in one place and learned to make it well. And the stoneworking, in particular, had reached a height it would never pass. For tens of thousands of years, human beings had worked stone, and now, in this settled age, they had mastered it utterly. They could flake flint to an edge sharper than any blade of later metal. They could grind and polish the hard stones into axes that felled the great trees and shaped the timber of the houses. Stone was the substance of their whole material world, the stuff of every cutting tool and weapon they owned. They were the finest workers of stone there had ever been, or ever would be. But stone, for all the skill spent upon it, had its limits, and those limits shaped everything. Stone is brittle. It shatters. An axe of stone, however finely ground, will crack against a knot of hard wood or a careless blow. A blade of flint, however sharp, will chip and break and must be remade. And stone cannot be joined or reshaped or made anew once broken. What is shattered is simply lost, thrown away, and a fresh piece must be worked from the start. The whole material world rested on a substance that was sharp and useful, but fragile and final, and could not be mended. And there was a deeper limit still, one the people would not even have known to name. Stone could only ever be shaped. It could be chipped, ground, polished, broken to a form, but it could never be transformed. A piece of flint was a piece of flint, from the moment it was struck to the moment it was thrown away. You could change its shape, but never its nature. The idea that a substance might be made to flow, to change its very form, to become liquid and then solid again in whatever shape you chose, was a thing no one had ever imagined, because nothing in the world had ever done it. This is the world, then, into which metal would come. A settled world of farmers and villages, of fields and flocks and full storehouses, a world of made things, of pottery and cloth and the finest stone tools ever fashioned. A world that had already, in the great settling, been more deeply changed than in all the ages before. The people of this world wanted for little. They lived well, by the measure of their time, secure in their villages, surrounded by their handiwork, masters of every craft their hands had ever learned. They had no notion that anything was missing, and yet something was coming that would change their world as deeply as the farm had, perhaps more deeply still. For all their mastery of stone, all their settled plenty, they stood on the edge of a discovery that would open a door no one knew was there. They were about to learn that the dull grey rock held something hidden, something that could be drawn out and transformed, something that would prove more useful and more beautiful and more powerful than any stone. They were about to find metal, and nothing in their settled world would prepare them for what it meant. It is worth pausing before that door opens to feel how complete their world seemed without it. We who know what came after look back and see the Copper Age as a beginning, a first step toward the metal world we live in. But to the people who lived at its dawn, there was no such knowing. There was only the settled life they had always known, the farming and the making and the keeping, whole and sufficient unto itself. The greatest changes always come so, into a world that feels finished, from a direction no one is watching. So it was with the farm. So it would be with metal. For the change that was coming did not announce itself. No one set out to find metal, or dreamed that the rock held it. It would come, when it came, by accident and by slow degrees, noticed at the edges of the settled life, in the bright, unusual stones that turned up here and there, in the strange behaviour of certain rocks set near a hot fire. It would creep in quietly, as the seed had crept in among the gatherers, unregarded at first, its vast meaning hidden. The people of the settled world were not waiting for it. They simply lived, and one day the bright thing appeared among them. So hold this settled world in mind, whole and ordered and sure, the farming villages standing among their fields beneath the rising smoke. This is the stage, set and waiting. The farmers go about their seasons. The storehouses stand full. The finest stone tools in all of history lie ready in skilled hands. And somewhere, in the grey rock of the hills, in a vein of dull ore no one has yet thought to wonder at, the thing that will change it all is waiting to be found. To see how it was found, we must go to the moment of discovery itself, the moment the bright stone first revealed its secret. Let us go there now. No one discovered metal. That is the first thing to understand. There was no single moment, no flash of insight, no one clever person who found it and showed the rest. Metal crept into the human world the way the dawn creeps into the sky, by slow degrees, across thousands of years and many lands, in 100 small noticings that added up at last to a new thing under the sun. It began not with a discovery, but with a curiosity, a question asked of a strange and pretty stone. And from that small wondering grew the whole metal world that you live in tonight. It began with native copper. For copper, unlike most metals, is sometimes found in the earth already pure, in lumps and nuggets and bright veins threading the grey rock, gleaming with that unmistakable reddish shine. Most metal hides in dull ore, locked away and needing fire to free it, but native copper lies there in the open, metal already, waiting to be picked up. And so it was the first that human beings ever noticed, glinting in a stream bed or a broken rock, a strange and lovely stone unlike any other, that caught the eye and begged to be gathered. Imagine the first person who picked up such a lump, turning it in the light, struck by its colour and its weight and its shine. It looked like a stone, and yet not like a stone. It was heavier, it gleamed, and when they tried to work it as they would work any stone, to flake it or chip it to an edge, it did something no stone had ever done. It did not flake, it did not shatter. Under the blow of the hammerstone, it dented, it bent, it changed its shape and held together, soft and yielding where stone was brittle and hard. Here was a stone that behaved like nothing else on earth. This was the first marvel, and it must have seemed like magic. For the whole of human history, stone had answered the hammer by breaking. You shaped it by taking pieces away, chip by chip, until the form emerged. But this bright stone could not be chipped at all. Instead, it could be beaten, pressed, hammered into shape without ever breaking. Its form changed not by removal but by persuasion. You could fold it, flatten it, draw it out, work it like wet clay that held its shape. The people had found, though they could not have known it, the first material that could be truly worked rather than merely broken. And so they worked it. With patient hammering, cold, just as it came from the earth, they beat the native copper into small things. Beads, first of all, and pins, and little ornaments, prized for their gleam and their strangeness. A bright bead of copper was a wonder, a thing that shone like nothing else a person owned, and it was worn and traded and treasured. The first metal in human hands was not a tool or a weapon but an ornament, a thing of beauty, valued for its shine long before anyone thought to ask what else it might do. But the cold hammering had a limit, and in meeting that limit, the people stumbled onto something deeper. For copper, worked too long with the hammer, grows hard and brittle. Beat it enough and it begins to crack, as though it tires, and will take no more shaping. The early workers must have met this again and again, a half-made thing turning stubborn and splitting under the hammer, the metal fighting back. It seemed the bright stone had its limit after all. And then, somehow, somewhere, someone found the answer in the fire. For when the hardened, brittle copper was put into the heat of a fire and then allowed to cool, a strange thing happened. It grew soft again. The tiredness left it. It could be hammered once more, shaped further, worked anew, as though the fire had given it fresh life. We call this annealing now, and we understand why it works. But to the people who found it, it was a second marvel, the discovery that fire could change the metal's very nature, could soften what had hardened, could renew the bright stone and let the working go on. Fire and metal had begun their long partnership. Think on what this meant, this marriage of fire and copper. The people already knew fire well. They had cooked with it, warmed themselves by it, fired their clay pots in it for generations. But now they had found that fire could do more than cook and warm and harden clay. It could work upon this bright stone, change it, master it. The knowledge of fire and the knowledge of metal had come together, and from that joining the whole craft of metalworking would grow. It is no accident that the potters, who knew fire best, were likely close to the first who learned to work the metal. And then came the greatest leap of all, the one that turned a clever craft into a true revolution. For native copper, pure and ready in the earth, is rare. There was never much of it, and a people who wanted more had only what they could find lying about. But copper hides also in other stones, in dull ores that do not gleam at all, in the green and blue rocks that streak the hills where copper lies beneath. These bright-coloured stones, the green and the blue, were known and gathered, perhaps for their colour, ground for pigment to paint the skin and the pot. No one knew they held metal locked inside, until, one day, by some accident we can only imagine, such a stone met a hot enough fire. Perhaps a lump of the green ore lay in the hearth, or in the fire that baked the pots where the heat ran higher than an ordinary blaze, and in that fierce heat, starved of air among the glowing charcoal, the stone did the impossible. It bled. Out of the dull rock ran tiny beads of bright metal, copper itself, sweated from the stone by the fire. The green stone had become metal. Someone, raking the cold ashes, found the bright droplets among them, and wondered. This was smelting, and it changed everything, for it meant that copper need no longer be merely found. It could be made. The dull and common ores, far more plentiful than the rare native metal, could be heated in a hot enough fire and made to yield their hidden copper. The bright stones of the hills were no longer just pretty rocks, but a source, a mine, a wellspring of metal for any who knew the secret of the fire. The supply of copper, once limited to what lay gleaming in the open, was thrown wide. There could now be metal in plenty, but smelting was no easy thing, and this is worth dwelling on, for it reveals how much these people came to know. To free the copper from the stone takes a fierce heat, far hotter than a cooking fire, hotter than the flame that fires a pot. It takes charcoal, burning fierce and starved of air, and it takes a way to drive that heat higher still by blowing air into the fire through pipes, or with bellows, forcing the burn to a white fury. The people learned all of this. They learned to build the furnace, to make the charcoal, to blow the fire to the heat that would melt metal from rock. It was knowledge hard won and carefully kept. And once the copper was freed, molten and glowing, the people learned the last great art, the one that crowned them masters of the metal. They learned to cast it. For melted copper is a liquid, and a liquid takes the shape of whatever holds it. So they made moulds of stone and of clay, carved with the shape of the thing they wished to make, an axe, a blade, a chisel. They poured the glowing metal into the mould and let it cool, and lifted out the finished shape, formed in a single pouring. No chipping, no grinding, no long labour of the stoneworker. The shape came whole from the mould. Sit with the wonder of that, for it was something the world had never seen. A substance made liquid by fire, poured like water, and then frozen solid into any shape you chose. Stone could only ever be taken away, shaped by removal, its form chipped out of a stubborn block. But metal could be made to flow and then to set, formed by addition, poured into whatever shape the maker dreamed. The very nature of making had changed. For the first time, a person could give a substance its form, not by breaking it down, but by pouring it out and letting it harden. It was a new kind of power over the stuff of the world, and the same metal could be made and unmade and made again, which was a marvel of its own. A stone axe, once broken, was lost forever, thrown away, a fresh one worked from scratch. But a copper axe, grown dull or bent or broken, was not lost at all. It could be melted down, the same metal poured into the mould anew, made fresh and whole again. The metal did not die. It could be reborn, again and again, the same bright substance taking shape after shape across the years. Nothing in the world of stone had ever offered such a thing. What broke could now be mended, what wore out could be made new. So gather the whole journey in your mind, for it is one of the great stories of human ingenuity. From the bright stone noticed in the stream bed, to the cold hammering that shaped it, to the fire that softened it anew, to the smelting that freed it from the dull ore, to the casting that poured it into any form. Step by step, across the long generations, in many lands at once, human beings had learned to master metal. They had found a substance that could be transformed, and they had learned to transform it. The age of stone, that had lasted since the very dawn of humankind, was quietly coming to its end. And yet, at first, the change was small, and this is the truth that gives the Copper Age its strange and humble character. For all the wonder of it, copper was not yet better than stone, not for the hard work of the world. Copper is soft. A copper axe, for all its gleam, is no match for a good stone one at felling a tree. Its edge bends and dulls where the flint bites true. So for a long time, stone and metal lived side by side, the stone tools still doing the hard daily labor, the precious copper kept for ornament, for show, for the fine and special things. The bright stone had come, but it had not yet conquered. This is why the age is named as it is, the age of copper and stone together, the two materials sharing the world. The metal was new and marvelous and full of promise, but its promise was not yet fulfilled. It gleamed in the ornament and the prized possession, while the stone still cut the wood and broke the ground. The great change had begun, but it would take long ages yet to come to its fullness, in the harder metal that lay still undiscovered. For now, the people had their bright, soft copper, and the one who could make it was becoming the most remarkable person in the world. Let us turn to that person now, to the smith. Every new thing in the world brings forth a new kind of person to master it. The farm brought forth the farmer. The pot brought forth the potter. And metal, the strangest and most powerful of all the new things, brought forth the strangest and most powerful new person of the age, the smith. The one who knew the secret of the fire and the ore, who could take the dull stone and draw bright metal from it, who could make the hard substance flow like water and freeze into any shape. In a world that had never seen such a thing, the smith must have seemed less a craftsman than a worker of magic. For think of how it would have looked to those who did not know the secret. The smith takes a green and worthless stone, a rock you might step over without a glance, and places it in the heart of a roaring fire. The fire is fed and blown to a fury, hotter than any cooking flame, until the very air shimmers above it. And then, from the cooling ashes, the smith draws out bright droplets of gleaming metal, where before there was only dull rock. The stone has been transformed. Something has been made from nothing, or so it seems, and only the smith knows how. To the watching eye, this was nothing short of wonder, and it was knowledge that made the wonder, hard won and carefully kept. The smith knew things that others did not, which stones held the metal, and which were merely coloured rock, how hot the fire must burn, and how to drive it to that heat with charcoal and blown air, how long to hold the ore in the flame, and how to know when the metal had come, how to pour it and cool it and work it without ruin. This was a deep and particular knowing, gathered across lifetimes, not easily come by and not easily shared. The smith carried it, and the carrying set the smith apart. It is likely that this knowledge was guarded, held close, passed down with care to a chosen few. For knowledge is power, and the knowledge of metal was a great power indeed. A smith who shared every secret freely would soon be no smith at all, only one of many. But a smith who kept the secret, who taught it only to a son or a chosen apprentice, remained needed, remained special, remained the one who could do the thing no one else could do. So the craft was likely handed down in families and small circles, a precious inheritance of knowing, kept within and guarded without. And there was, perhaps, something more than mere craft secrecy in it, for the working of metal sat close to mystery, close to the sacred, in the minds of people who saw the world as full of spirits and unseen powers. To transform a stone by fire, to make substance flow and change its nature, was to do a thing that touched the very order of the world. It would not be strange if the smith's craft was wrapped in ritual, hedged with words and acts meant to keep the spirits favourable, the fire willing, the metal true. The smith may have been part craftsman and part something nearer to a priest of the fire. We see hints of this in what the smiths made, for not all their work was tools. Among the finest things the Copper Age has left behind are objects of no practical use at all, made purely for show, for ceremony, for power. Maces too fine to swing in anger, crowns and sceptres and standards of worked copper, gleaming symbols of rank and right. In one hidden cave, hundreds of such objects were found together, a treasure of copper crowns and maces and wands, made with astonishing skill, for purposes we can only guess, ceremony and rule and the marking of who stood above. The smith made the very emblems of power. Think on what that means. The smith did not only make the useful things, the awl and the chisel and the blade. The smith made the things that said who mattered, the shining mace carried by the chief, the copper ornament that marked the person of rank, the gleaming symbols that set the high above the low. In a world where most things were of stone and bone and clay, a thing of bright metal was a thing apart, and to own it was to be marked as someone. And the one who made these marks of standing was, by that very power, a person of standing too, for the smith made what no amount of ordinary labour could produce. A farmer, however hard he worked, grew grain, as every farmer did. A potter shaped clay, as every potter did. But the smith made gleaming metal, rare and marvellous, that came from nowhere else and no one else. The smith's work could not be matched by the strength of arms or the sweat of the brow. It came only from the secret knowing, and so it was precious, and so was the one who held it. The smith stood outside the common round of village labour, a maker of wonders in a world of plain work. And the smith's work drew the threads of the wider world together, for metal does not lie everywhere. The ore is found only in certain places, in particular hills and veins, and the charcoal must be made, and the finished metal carried far to those who want it. So the smith stood at the heart of a web of getting and making and trading that reached across great distances. The smith needed the ore from the mine, the fuel from the forest, and made the goods that travelled far along the trading paths. Where the smith worked, the world gathered, the raw stuff coming in and the bright metal going out. It is worth saying plainly that we cannot be wholly sure how the smith was seen, for the dead do not speak their station to us clearly. Some have thought the early smiths great figures, honoured and high. Others read the signs more cautiously, and warn against making too much of them. The truth is likely that it varied, from place to place and time to time. The smith honoured here, ordinary there, wrapped in mystery in one land and plainly a worker in the next. But everywhere, the smith did a thing that no one else could do, and that alone made the smith a figure unlike any the older world had known. What is sure is that the smith was a specialist in a way that deepened a change the settled life had begun. For the smith could not farm and forge both. The craft took all of a person, the long learning, the constant practice, the full attention. A true smith was a smith and little else, fed by the surplus of others, freed from the field to follow the fire. This was the specialist, taken further than ever before, a person wholly given to one difficult craft, supported by the community because the community needed what only that person could make. The village had grown complex enough to keep such a person and to need one. And in the smith we see the shape of much that was to come, for the smith was the first of the great makers who would stand at the centre of every civilization after, the craftsman whose skill the whole society depended upon and prized. The metalworker would only grow in importance as the ages turned, as copper gave way to bronze and bronze to iron, as weapons and tools and the very strength of nations came to rest upon the smith's fire. That long and mighty line of makers, stretching down to the forges and foundries of today, begins here with the first person who learned to draw metal from the stone. Picture the smith at work. Then, in the warm dark of the workshop, the fire glowing fierce, fed and blown to its white heat, the ore within, giving up its hidden metal, the bright copper gathered, melted, poured glowing into the waiting mould, the hammer ringing as the cooled metal is worked to its final form and edge. The smith bent close over the labour, face lit by the fire, hands sure with the knowing of many years. It is a scene of skill and patience and quiet power, the making of wonders by one who has given a life to learning how. And around the smith, the life of the village goes on, but with this new thing at its heart. The farmers bring their grain, some of which feeds the smith who grows none. The chief comes for his gleaming mace, his copper standard, the emblems of his rule. The traders come for the bright goods to carry far away. The young apprentice watches, learning the guarded secret that will one day be his to keep. The smith sits at the centre of it all, the maker of the bright new substance that everyone wants and only the smith can make. A new kind of person, for a new kind of world. So the smith stands as one of the great figures this forgotten age brought forth, the master of fire and ore, the maker of the first metal and the first gleaming symbols of power. Whether honoured as near to magic or known as simply a skilled hand, the smith did what no one before had ever done, and changed the world by doing it. The bright stone alone was only a marvel. It was the smith who turned that marvel into tools and ornaments and emblems, who carried the knowing and worked the fire and made the metal flow. Without the smith, the copper in the rock was nothing. With the smith, it became the dawn of a new age, but the smith and the metal did not stand apart from ordinary life. They were woven into it, into the daily round of the village, the waking and the working and the resting that filled the people's days as they fill our own. To truly understand this age, we must do more than marvel at the smith and the bright new metal. We must go down into an ordinary day and see how the people lived, with the field and the fold still at the heart of things, and the new gleam of copper among them. So let us leave the workshop now, and step into one Copper Age day, from its waking to its rest. Let us step now into a single day, not a great day of some rare event, but an ordinary one, the kind that came and went 10,000 times, and was never marked because nothing happened in it but living. This is the truest way to know a vanished world, not through its wonders or its kings, but through the quiet shape of its ordinary hours. So come down now into a village of the Copper Age, in the warm lands where the first metal was worked, and wake into a day that is much like all the others, and let it carry you slowly towards sleep. You wake before the light, in the close dark of the house, to the sounds of the village stirring. A cockerel, perhaps, for the people keep birds now, the soft lowing of cattle in their pen, the first voices, low and easy, of those already risen. For a while you do not move. You lie warm beneath the woven covers, listening to the breathing of your family around you. And beyond the thick mud wall of the house, the village waking, the same waking it has known every morning for longer than anyone can remember. This is a settled place, and you belong to it utterly. Your house is a solid thing, built to last, and it speaks of a people who mean to stay. Its walls are of mud brick, shaped from clay and straw, and dried hard in the sun, thick enough to hold the night's cool against the heat of day, and the day's warmth against the bright night. The roof is of timber, and thatch and packed earth. The floor is of beaten clay, swept smooth and clean. It is a good house, warm and dry, and your family has lived in it for years, and will live in it for years more. In some villages, the houses run even deeper, dug down into the earth itself, cool underground rooms against the fierce sun. You rise into the dim of the early house, and move among its familiar things, for this is a home full of belongings. In a way the wandering world never knew. There are the great jars of fired clay along the wall, holding the grain and the oil and the water. There are baskets, and tools of stone and bone, and the woven cloth folded away. There are the fine painted pots the women make, decorated with careful patterns in red and dark, beautiful as well as useful, and somewhere, kept safe and precious, perhaps a small thing of copper, a pin or an ornament, the one bright marvel in a house of clay and stone and wood. You step out from the house into the cool of the morning, and there is the village all around you, waking to the day. The houses stand close together, their mud walls warm-coloured in the early light, smoke beginning to rise from the rooftops, paths run between them, worn smooth by generations of feet. Beyond the houses lie the fields, green or gold with the season's grain, and past them the rough pasture where the flocks will graze. A stream or a river runs nearby, the water that gives the village life. You stand a moment in the freshening air, and breathe it in, and turn to the day's work. For there is always work. The first task, as ever, is the fire. Through the night it has burned low on the hearth, and now it must be woken. You crouch and lay dry tinder on the embers and breathe gently upon them, coaxing the glow back to flame, feeding it small sticks and then larger until it stands warm and bright. Fire to warm the morning, fire to cook the day's food, fire at the heart of the home. It is the same fire the hunters knew, and the first farmers, and it will be the heart of every home for ages yet to come. But in this age, as you know, fire has learned a new and greater trick, away in the smith's hot furnace. The morning's food is taken simply, when there is a moment for it. There is bread, flat loaves baked on the hearthstone from the grain you grow, the plain and reliable centre of every meal. There is cheese, perhaps, or soured milk from the morning's milking, for the flocks give their daily gift. There are lentils and onions, and in their season the fruits of the trees the people tend, the fig and the date and the olive. It is good food, varied and sufficient, drawn from the field and the fold and the orchard, the settled abundance of a people who have learned to make the land feed them well. And then the work of the day spreads out across the village, each to their task, for a settled life of farming asks a great deal of patient, ordered labour. There is no single great hunt to be won or lost, but the long, steady, repeating work of the fields and the flocks and the home, the work that never quite ends and must be taken up again each morning. The village is a thing of many hands, each with its part, and the day fills quickly with the doing of it all, from the first light to the last. There is a rhythm to it, sure and unhurried, the rhythm of a people settled into their place. Many go out to the fields, for the land must be worked through all its seasons. There is ground to be broken with the hoe and the digging stick, and in this age, in some places, with a new thing, the plough, dragged through the earth to open it faster than any hand could. There is the sowing and the long tending of the crop, the weeding and the watching and the carrying of water in the dry months. The grain in the field is the life of the village, and its care is the great labour of the year, calling the people out to the land morning upon morning. Others take the flocks to pasture, leading the sheep and the goats and the cattle out from their pens to graze the rough ground beyond the fields. The beasts are a great wealth now, giving milk and wool and meat and the young that swell the herd, and they must be watched and guarded and brought home safe at dusk. The herder's day is spent in the open with the animals, a quieter labour than the field, but no less needful, for the flocks cannot be left, and their milking, morning and evening, sets its own unbreaking rhythm on the days. Back within the village, the work of making goes on, the crafts that a settled life allows. Here a woman shapes wet clay into a pot and paints it with careful patterns before the firing. There another spins thread from wool or flax, or works it on the loom into cloth. Someone grinds grain to flour on the quern, the slow daily labour that feeds the household. Someone shapes a tool of bone, or knaps a blade of flint, for stone is still the substance of most daily work. The village hums with these patient crafts, the making of all the things a settled life requires. And somewhere in the village, or just beyond it, there is the one craft that sets this age apart from all before. The smith is at work. From a certain quarter rises a different smoke, a fiercer heat, and the ring of a hammer on metal. There the bright copper is worked, the ore smelted, the gleaming things made that no other craft can make. You may pass that way and glimpse it, the glow of the furnace, the smith bent close over the fire, the bright metal taking shape. It is a part of the village now, this new and wondrous craft, woven into the life of the place like any other, and yet unlike any other. Perhaps today you have reason to go to the smith. A copper awl has bent, or you wish for a pin, or the household has saved enough to trade for some small, bright thing. You bring what you have to offer, grain or cloth or a beast, for the smith grows no food and must be fed by those who want the work. And you watch, as the smith takes the metal and works it in the fire and makes the thing you came for. It is a small marvel, every time, the dull metal made bright and useful by the smith's secret skill. You carry it home, a thing of copper, precious in a house of plainer stuff. By the middle of the day the work has eased, and here is a thing worth marking. The people of this village are not bent to ceaseless toil. The settled life, for all its labour, is a sure one, and the food it gives is steady enough that the getting of it does not eat every hour. There is time in the day, real time, for rest in the heat of noon, for the slow, easy talk of those who share all their days, for sitting in the shade while the worst of the sun passes. The settled people work hard, but they are not slaves to the work, and the day has its quiet hours as well as its busy ones. And the village is a crowded, peopled place, far more so than the camps of the old wandering world. For the settled life, with its sure food, lets the people grow many, and a thriving village holds not a few dozen souls but many hundreds, living close together. There are children everywhere, more than the old world ever had, for in a settled home a mother need not carry each one on endless marches, and families grow large. The young ones run among the houses, minding the littler ones, helping at the small tasks, learning by doing the ways of the settled life they are born to. To live so close-packed, in such numbers, is itself a thing the people have had to learn. The old hunting bands were small, and all of one kin, and when tempers frayed, people could simply part across the wide land. But in the village there is no such escape. The same faces meet day upon day, year upon year, and the people must find the ways to live alongside one another in their numbers, to share and cooperate, to settle quarrels, to bear the constant nearness of so many. The village runs on this, on the daily art of living together, woven through every hour of the day. For the village leans on cooperation in everything it does. The harvest must be brought in by many hands against the turning weather. The flocks are watched in turn. A house is raised with the help of neighbours. The ditch that brings water to the fields is dug and kept by the labour of all. When sickness or hard luck strikes a household, the others may carry it through. The settled life binds the people into a web of mutual need, far tighter than the scattered hunters ever knew. And the village holds together because its people hold to one another. And the village has its order, its ways of deciding and ruling, for so many people living so close cannot live without it. There are those whose word carries weight. The elders, the heads of families, perhaps a chief who leads. There are the customs and the understandings that keep the peace, that share the water and the land, that settle who may do what and who must answer for it. It is not yet the heavy rule of kings and laws that later ages would know, but it is the beginning of that ordering, the first shapes of authority, growing because a crowded, settled world cannot do without it. And woven through the day is the unseen world, the realm of the spirits, and the powers the people feel all around them. They worship, in their way, the forces that give and take life, the earth that bears the grain, the beasts that feed them, the mystery of birth and growth and death. There are the small holy things in the house, the figures of clay, perhaps a goddess of fertility and life. There are the fire and the rites that mark the turning seasons, the sowing and the harvest, the bringing of rain. The sacred runs through the ordinary day, never far from the people's minds and hands. As the sun crosses to the west, the day's labour begins to come home. The herders bring the flocks down from the pasture to the safety of the pens. The workers come in from the fields, their tools upon their shoulders. The evening milking is done, the beasts secured against the night, the day's tasks brought to their close. Smoke thickens from the hearths across the rooftops as the evening meal is made, and the village draws in upon itself as the light fails, gathering into its homes against the coming dark, the way it has every evening for longer than memory holds. The evening meal is the gathering of the household around the hearth, the same family, in the same room, around the same fire, night upon night. There is bread and cheese and a stew of lentils and grain in the painted pot, and the talk of the day's doings. The firelight flickers on the walls, on the great jars, on the faces of the family gathered close. This quiet hour, so ordinary that we scarcely think of it, is one of the settled world's gentlest gifts. The home at evening, the people together, fed and warm and safe within their walls. And after the meal perhaps, the talk and the telling, as the fire burns low, the old stories told, of how the world came to be, of the spirits and the ancestors and the deep past. The news of the village shared, the small doings of the day, and perhaps tonight talk of the bright metal, of the smith's latest work, of the gleaming thing some chief has come to own, for the copper is a wonder still, a thing worth speaking of. The children listen, drowsy in the warmth, taking in the words that hold all a people knows, passed down by the voice alone as they have always been. Then the dark is full, and the fire burns low, and the village settles to sleep. The doors are shut, the flocks are quiet in their pens. The grain stands safe in the great jars along the wall, and the family lies down to rest in the home that does not move, on the beaten floor or the low platform, gathered close in the warm dark. Somewhere the smith's furnace has cooled at last. Somewhere a bright thing of copper lies gleaming faintly in the dark, the one new marvel in a world grown old and settled and sure. The village sleeps as it has slept 10,000 nights, and this same round will come again tomorrow, and the day after, through all the turning seasons of the year, the waking and the fire, the field and the fold, the making and the gathering home. This is the rhythm of the Copper Age village, steady and repeating, the settled life of the first farmers carried on with the new gleam of metal. Among it is an ordinary day, lived 10,000 times and good. But this settled world was not a paradise, whatever its plenty, and the bright new metal brought shadows as well as wonders. To see them, we must turn now to the harder truths of the age. Let us turn to them. The bright metal did a thing that went far beyond the village that made it. It reached out across the land and drew the scattered world together, and knit distant peoples into a web of getting and giving that stretched further than anything before. For copper was not only a marvel to own, it was a thing to want and a thing to trade, and the wanting and the trading of it sent goods and people and ideas flowing across great distances. The age of metal was also, from its very dawn, the age of the long trade, and the two were bound together, each one feeding the other. To see why, you must understand a simple thing about copper. It does not lie everywhere. The ore is found only in certain places, in particular hills and certain veins of stone, scattered here and there across the wide land, and nowhere else at all. A village might have fine fields and good pasture, and yet no copper within many days' walk. And another, in the hills, might sit upon a rich vein of ore and have metal in plenty. The metal was unevenly given, and that unevenness was the seed of trade. For those who had it could give to those who had it not. And copper, once it was wanted everywhere. For there is no village so remote that its people do not desire the bright and useful thing once they have seen it. The chief wants his gleaming mace, the woman wants her copper pin, the household wants the awl and the blade that the metal makes. So a demand arose across the whole settled world, a hunger for copper in 1,000 villages, and only a few places could supply it. The metal had to move, from the few hills that held it to the many places that craved it, and in that moving the trade was born. So the copper travelled, and it travelled far. From the hills where the ore was dug and smelted, the bright metal was carried out across the land, passed from hand to hand and village to village, traded onward and onward, until it reached places hundreds of miles from where it was made. We can trace these journeys now, for the metal carries the mark of the ore it came from, and we find copper from a single source spread across vast distances, far from its home hills. The bright stone of one place ended its journey in the hands of people who had never seen the hills that bore it. Think of the roads it travelled, though they were not roads as we would know them. The rivers were the great highways, the water-carrying boats laden with goods far faster and easier than any journey on foot. Along the rivers the copper moved, and the other goods of trade with it. And there were the land paths, the tracks worn between villages, along which people carried their burdens. And in this age the first beasts of burden began to bear the loads, easing the long hauls. By water and by foot and by laden beast, the goods of the trade made their slow way across the settled world. And copper was not the only thing that moved along these roads, for once the paths of trade were open, all manner of precious things flowed along them. There were fine stones, the best for working, carried far from the few places that gave them. There were shells from distant seas, prized for ornament, travelling far inland to people who had never seen the ocean. There was gold where it was found, brighter even than copper. There were the things one region made well and another could not, the fine pottery, the woven cloth, the worked goods of skilled hands. The roads carried a wealth of wanted things, and copper was the brightest among them. This was something new in the scale of the world, this reaching web of trade. The peoples of older ages had traded too, passing goods hand to hand across the land, but never on this scale, never with such richness, never binding so many distant places so tightly together. The hunger for metal had thrown the roads wide and set the goods flowing as never before, until the settled world was laced with paths of trade, and a thing made in one place might end its days a vast distance off, in the hands of strangers who knew nothing of its makers. The world had grown more connected than it had ever been, and along those same roads with the goods travelled something less visible but greater still, ideas. For when peoples meet to trade, they pass more than objects. They pass knowledge, fashion, news, belief. The trader who carried copper carried also word of distant places, of new ways of making, of how things were done elsewhere. The secret of the metal itself spread so, from the lands that first knew it outward across the world, carried along the trading paths from people to people. The trade in things was also a trade in knowing, and the knowing spread the faster for it. So the working of metal itself travelled the roads of trade. From its first homelands outward, to peoples who had never known it. Where the trade reached, the knowledge of copper often followed, the understanding of which stones held metal and how to free it by fire. Some places learned to work the metal themselves, taught by the spreading knowledge. Others were content to trade for the finished goods. But everywhere the roads reached, the metal and its mystery spread a little further, until the bright stone and the craft of it were known across a vast sweep of the settled world. And the trade did more than move goods and knowledge. It bound the distant peoples into a kind of fellowship, a loose and far-flung community of those who traded with one another. The village in the hills that dug the ore came to depend on the villages of the plain that grew the grain it ate. The villages of the plain came to depend on the hills for their metal. Each needed what the other had, and that need bound them, across all the distance between, into a web of mutual reliance. The trade made strangers into partners, distant places into neighbours of a sort. There is a word we might borrow for this, though it would have meant nothing to them. The beginnings of something like a wider world, an early kind of the connectedness we know so well today. For here, in this forgotten age, the threads were first drawn tight that would one day weave the whole world together. The long trade, the dependence of distant places each upon the other, the flow of goods and knowledge across great distances. It is the faint and ancient beginning of the connected world, and it grew, in no small part, from the hunger for a bright, soft metal. And with the trade came new kinds of people and new kinds of power, for where goods move and wealth gathers, some will rise to control the moving and the gathering. The one who held a copper source held a great prize, and could grow rich and mighty upon it. The one who controlled a stretch of the trading road, or a place where the routes met, could take a share of all that passed. Trade made wealth, and wealth made power, and certain people and certain places grew great upon the flow of metal and goods. The shining trade lifted some far above the rest. This is a thing worth marking, for it points toward a change we will come to. The trade did not enrich all alike. It enriched those who held the sources, the roots, the means to gather and control the flow. A village upon a copper vein, a chief who commanded a trading path, a person who could amass the bright goods and the wealth they brought. These rose, while others did not. The shining trade, for all the good it spread, also gathered wealth into certain hands, and in that gathering lay the seed of new and deeper divisions between people. We will return to that shadow, but see first the brightness of it, the wonder of a world drawn together. Picture the copper, dug from a hill in one far land, smelted by a smith, traded down a river, carried along a path, passed from hand to hand across 100 miles and a dozen peoples, until at last it gleams in the hand of someone who will never know where it came from. Picture the shells of a distant sea worn by a person who has never seen salt water. Picture the knowledge of the fire spreading village to village across a continent. This was the shining trade, and it made the world, for the first time, a single connected place. It is one more way that this forgotten age laid the ground for all that followed. The great trading networks of later times, the routes that would one day carry goods across whole continents and bind the world into one, did not spring up from nothing. They grew from beginnings like these, from the first long trade in metal and precious things, from the first time distant peoples came to need and know one another across the wide land. The roads that the copper travelled were the ancestors of every trade route that would ever cross the earth. So the bright metal reached far beyond the workshop and the village, out across the whole settled world, drawing it together as never before. The trade in copper was the trade that connected the ancient world, the flow of metal and goods and knowledge that knit the scattered peoples into something larger than themselves. And yet, as we have begun to see, all this wonder had its shadow. The metal that connected the world also divided it, gathering wealth and power into certain hands, deepening the gaps between people. This was no paradise, this age of the bright stone. Let us turn now to its harder truths. It would be easy, after all this, to imagine the age of the bright stone as a kind of golden dawn, the settled villages, the rich trade, the marvellous new metal gleaming in the firelight. And there is truth in that picture. The Copper Age was a time of wonder and invention, of a world growing richer and more connected than ever before. But it was not a paradise, and to pretend otherwise would be to miss the deepest thing the metal did. For the bright stone, along with all its gifts, brought shadows, and the longest of those shadows was this. The metal made some people rich and made others poor, more deeply than ever before. To see why, you must remember what metal was. It was wealth, a thing of value that could be owned, hoarded, gathered, passed on. The settled farmers already had the beginnings of wealth, in their stored grain and their flocks. But grain rots, and beasts die, and neither gleams. Metal was different. It did not spoil. It could be kept forever, melted and remade, piled up without limit. It was beautiful and rare and wanted by all. And so metal became the perfect vessel for wealth, the thing into which a person could pour their having, and hold it, and show it to the world. And because metal could be gathered, it could be gathered unequally. Some came to have much of it, and some little, and some none at all. The chief with his gleaming maces and his copper standards, the trader grown rich on the flow of metal, the family that held a copper source or commanded a stretch of the trading road. These gathered the bright wealth to themselves, while the common farmer in his field might own, in all his life, a single small pin of copper, or nothing at all. The metal sorted the people, the shining few above the plainer many. This sorting was not wholly new, for the settled life had begun it. We have seen how the storehouse and the surplus first let some have more than others, how rank and property had stirred in the farming villages. But metal deepened it, sharpened it, made it gleam. For now there was a thing that could hold great wealth in a small and lasting and beautiful form, a thing that announced a person standing at a glance. The bright copper made the gaps between people visible, undeniable, set in shining metal for all to see. The divisions that the farm had begun, the metal carved deeper, and nowhere is this seen more starkly than in how the people buried their dead, for the grave does not lie. In the cemeteries of this age, some were laid to rest in astonishing splendour, heaped about with copper and gold and precious things, sent into death as kings, and beside them others lay in the bare earth with nothing at all, or with a single humble pot. The same ground held the richest and the poorest, divided in death as they had been in life. We will come to one such place, the most dazzling of all, where the gulf between the buried rich and the buried poor is laid bare in gold. Here we must pause for honesty, for the matter is not so simple as it first seems. Some who study these things urge caution. They point out that copper, in some places and times, was not so rare as we imagine, that the working of it was not always the deepest secret, that a grave full of metal does not always mean a person of great power. The reasons one body was buried rich and another poor may be tangled, bound up with things we cannot easily read, with age and kin and the manner of a death. We should not leap too quickly from gleaming graves to kings and slaves. The truth was likely more varied than that. And yet, when all the caution is granted, the broad shape remains. Across this age, in place after place, the signs of growing inequality multiply. The richer houses and the poorer, the lavish graves and the bare, the gathering of fine things into certain hands, the rise of those who command and those who obey. Whatever the tangles of the particular case, the long trend is plain enough. The settled world, and the metal that came into it, were pulling the people apart, into the high and the low, more surely than any age before. The old rough equality of the wandering world was passing away, and the metal brought a second shadow, darker than the first, for it did not only make wealth, it made weapons. The bright copper that gleamed in the ornament could also be cast into a blade, an axe, a dagger, a point. And these were not only tools for the field and the forest, they were tools for the killing of people. For the first time, human beings had a substance from which to make in plenty the instruments of war, and they made them. The same fire that poured the copper pin poured also the copper dagger, and the dagger had but one purpose. It is true that people had always fought and always had weapons of a kind. The hunters had their spears and their bows, made for the killing of beasts, but turned, often enough, against other people. The farmers had quarrelled and raided and shed blood. Violence was no invention of the Copper Age. But something shifted now, for now there were weapons made of metal, prized and gleaming, and weapons made not for the hunt but for war alone. The dagger is not for the deer, the mace is not for the field. These were made for one thing only, the meeting of human against human, and their coming marks a change, for we find, In this age, the first weapons that were clearly made to kill people rather than animals. The dagger, short and sharp, for the close and deadly work of fighting. The mace, a heavy head meant to break a skull, useless for any other task. The fighting axe. These speak of a world where war had become a thing in itself, a part of life to be prepared for, a reason to pour the precious metal into the shapes of killing. The bright stone, the marvel of the age, was being made into the means of human destruction. The shadow had fallen across the wonder. And we have a witness to this, a single person preserved across 5,000 years who tells us more than any grave. High in the mountains, frozen in the ice, a man of the Copper Age was found in our own time, kept whole by the cold across all the ages. He carried with him the finest record we have of how a person of this age lived and died, and among his things was an axe, its blade of nearly pure copper, a tool to fell trees and a weapon both, and a precious thing, a mark perhaps of a man of some standing. He is our clearest window into the age of the bright stone, but it is how he died that speaks loudest, for this man did not die gently in his bed. When his frozen body was studied, the truth came out. There was an arrowhead lodged in his shoulder, driven in from behind. There was a wound on his hand, the kind a person takes fighting off a blade. There were signs of a blow to the head. This man of the Copper Age was killed, struck down in the high mountains, fleeing or fighting some enemy across the cold heights. His death is a window into the violence of his age, the raiding and the fighting that the new weapons served. Think on what his death tells us. Here was a man, well equipped, carrying a copper axe and a bow he was still making, high in the wild mountains, who met his end at the hands of others. Whether he fled a raid, or fought a feud, or fell to enemies for reasons we will never know, he died by human violence, in an age that had learned to make metal weapons. He is not a king in a golden grave, but he tells the same story from the other side. The Copper Age was a world where a person might be hunted and killed by other people. It was not a gentle time, and the fear of such violence shaped the very places people lived. For across this age, in many lands, the villages began to wall themselves. Where once a settlement stood open to the world, now it raised defences, ditches and banks and walls of stone, to keep out those who might come for what it held. Some places grew into true strongholds, set on high ground, ringed with walls, made to be defended. A people do not build a wall against nothing. The walls of the Copper Age speak of a world where raiding and war had become real enough to build against, where the having of wealth had bred the fear of losing it. So picture this other face of the age, alongside the wonder, the gleaming graves of the rich and the bare graves of the poor, divided in the same ground. The bright daggers and maces, made for the killing of people, the frozen man in the mountains struck down by enemies. The walls rising around the villages, against the coming raid. This was the shadow side of the metal, the cost that came with the marvel. The same bright stone that connected the world and adorned the chief also deepened the gulf between rich and poor and armed the hand that killed. Wonder and shadow, together in the one age. And the two were bound together, the wealth and the war, each feeding the other. For where there is wealth to be had, there is wealth to be taken. And where there is wealth worth taking, there is war to take it. The metal that made some rich gave others a reason to raid them. The gathered wealth of a village made it a prize. The strongholds rose to guard the riches, and the weapons were forged to seize them, and round it went. The shining trade and the gleaming wealth and the bright weapons of war were all one thing, all born of the same bright stone, all part of the same deep change. This is the honest truth of the age, then, neither golden dawn nor simple darkness, but something more tangled and more human. The Copper Age gave wonders, the metal and the trade and the connected world, and it gave shadows, the deepening of inequality, the first weapons of war, the walls and the raiding and the gulf between rich and poor. It was a real age, lived by real people, and real ages are never only bright. The bright stone lifted humankind and divided it, adorned it and armed it, in the very same motion. That is the way of the deepest changes. They give and they take together. And having seen both faces of the age, the wonder and the shadow, we are ready to look closely at one place where they meet most dazzlingly of all. For there is a single ancient cemetery, By a far sea, where the wealth and the rank and the gleaming inequality of this age are written in more gold than anywhere else on earth, the oldest worked gold the world has ever found. There, the whole story of the bright stone, its splendor and its division, lies buried in the ground. Let us go to it now, to the Gold of Varna. To truly understand what the bright metal did to the world, it helps to look closely at one place where it shines most dazzlingly of all. By the shore of a great inland sea, in the land we now call Bulgaria, there lived a people of the Copper Age who left behind something astonishing, a cemetery, a ground where they buried their dead, across the generations, with such splendor and such strangeness that it has become one of the most important discoveries in all the study of the human past, for in this ground was found the oldest worked gold on earth, and with it, the oldest clear record of a world divided into rich and poor. The finding of it, like so many great findings, was an accident. Not so very long ago, in our own time, a man was at work with a digging machine on the edge of a modern city, and in the soil he turned up strange objects, bright and old, that he could not understand. He gathered them and took them home, and only later thought to bring them to those who might know what they were. And what they were was the first glimpse of a treasure 5,000 years buried, the opening of a door into the world of the Copper Age dead. What the diggers uncovered, as they followed that first find into the earth, was a vast and ancient cemetery, hundreds of graves laid down across the generations by a people who had lived and died here long before the first cities of Mesopotamia or Egypt, long before the pyramids, long before almost anything we think of as ancient. These were people of the Copper Age, farmers and herders and traders and smiths, who had buried their dead with care by the great sea, and whose graves had lain undisturbed across all the thousands of years between their world and ours. And as the graves came to light, one by one, a strange and telling pattern emerged from the earth. The graves were not the same, they were not equal. Some held little, a few simple things, a clay pot, a blade of flint, a handful of beads. Others held more, and a few held riches beyond anything the diggers had imagined possible from so deep in the human past. The very ground was divided, the poor graves and the rich graves lying together in the one cemetery, the inequality of a living world preserved in the arrangement of its dead. Here, written in the earth, was the gulf the metal had made. For the rich graves of this place held gold, worked gold, shaped and beaten and crafted into ornaments and emblems, gleaming as bright as the day it was made across all the ages it had lain in the dark. And this was the wonder that made the cemetery famous across the world, the thing that set it apart from every other find. For this was the oldest worked gold ever discovered anywhere on earth. Here, by this far sea, in the age of copper, human beings had first learned to work the brightest and most precious of all metals, and had buried it with their honoured dead. Think on what that means, the oldest gold in the world. Before this, no one knew that gold had been worked so early, in so forgotten an age, by a people so little remembered. We think of gold as the metal of pharaohs and kings, of the great civilizations of later times. But here it was, far older than any of them, gleaming in the graves of a Copper Age people by the Black Sea. The working of gold, like the working of copper, began in this forgotten age, in the hands of smiths whose names are lost, who first learned to shape the bright eternal metal that has been treasured ever since. And the amount of it staggers belief. In this one cemetery, by this one people, there was found more worked gold than in all the rest of the world together from the same age. Every other place on earth that has given up gold from those distant centuries, all of them combined, do not match what lay in these graves. This small people, on the shore of one sea, had gathered and worked more gold than the whole of the rest of humankind in their time. It is a concentration of wealth so extreme that it is hard to grasp, the riches of an age pooled in a single ground. But the deeper wonder is not the gold itself, it is how the gold was shared, or rather, how it was not. For the treasure was not spread evenly among the graves. It was gathered overwhelmingly into a very few. Of all the gold in all the hundreds of graves, the great mass of it lay in just a handful of burials, a few rich dead holding between them the lion's share of all the wealth, while the many others lay with little or nothing. The gold did not mark a rich people, It marked a few rich persons, among a people most of whom had almost none. This is the thing that makes Varna matter so much, beyond its gold, for it is among the oldest clear evidence we have of a society sharply divided, of the few who had much and the many who had little, set down in the ground for us to read. Here, 5,000 years and more ago, was a world already split into the high and the low, the rich and the poor, in a way we know all too well in our own time. The cemetery by the sea is a window onto the birth of inequality, the moment the gulf between people grew wide and deep and was buried with the dead. And one grave above all others tells the story. Among the hundreds of burials, there was one that held more than any other the resting place of a single man. He had died, it seems, in middle age, and he had been laid in the earth with a splendour that sets him apart from every other soul in that ground. About him lay gold in abundance, more gold in that one grave than in the entire rest of the world of his age. He was sent into death not as a common farmer, but as something far greater, adorned and armed and gilded, a person of the very highest rank. Picture him as he was laid to rest, his body adorned with gold, gold upon his arms and at his throat, gold ornaments gleaming across him, a heavy axe of copper at his side and other fine weapons, the marks of power and war, a sceptre, the emblem of one who rules, of authority over others, fine pottery, precious stones, shells carried from distant seas. Everything about his burial cries out that here was a person who stood above the rest, a chief, a leader, perhaps what a later age would simply call a king, the first such figure, perhaps, that the record of the human past clearly shows us. And the weapons and the sceptre tell us what kind of greatness was his. For he was not buried as a maker, with the tools of a craft, nor as a farmer, with the gear of the field. He was buried as a man of power, with the emblems of rule and the weapons of war. The sceptre says he commanded. The gold says he was rich beyond his fellows. The weapons say he could enforce his will, or had others who would. Here is the shape of a new kind of person, the powerful man set above the rest, holding wealth and command and force, the lord of his people. The Copper Age had made him possible. But the most haunting graves of Varna are not the richest, they are the empty ones. For among the burials were some that held no body at all, only the grave goods, the gold and the precious things laid out in the earth, as if around a person who was not there. These empty graves, these burials of no one, were among the richest of all, heaped with gold, arranged with the greatest care. Someone had dug a grave and filled it with treasure and buried no body in it, and we do not know why. It is one of the great mysteries of this ancient ground. What were these empty graves for? Perhaps they honoured someone whose body could not be recovered, lost at sea or in some far place, given a grave of treasure though the person was gone. Perhaps they were offerings to the gods or the spirits, gold given to the earth or the powers below, a sacrifice of wealth. Perhaps they marked some role or office rather than a person, the grave of a kingship rather than a king. We cannot know, but there is something deeply moving in these graves of no one, these treasures laid in the earth around an absence, by a people whose reasons died with them. And in some of these empty graves there was a strange and wonderful thing, a face made of clay, set where the head would lie, with the features marked out and ornaments of gold placed upon it as a person would wear them. Gold where the eyes would be, gold at the mouth, gold upon the brow, a face of clay and gold standing in for the missing person, gazing up out of the earth across 5,000 years. To look upon such a thing is to feel the reach of these people towards something we cannot name, their care for their dead and their absent, expressed in gold and clay by the giving sea. Now, here we must be careful and honest, for the temptation is to make of Varna a simple tale of kings and slaves, and the truth is subtler. We cannot be wholly sure what the gold meant to these people, or exactly how their society was ordered. The rich grave may mark a ruler, or it may mark something we do not understand, a holy person, a sacrifice, a role we have no word for. The reasons one person was buried in gold and another in bare earth may be tangled in ways we cannot now unravel. We should hold the wonder of Varna without claiming to know more than the ground can tell us. And yet, when all the caution is granted, the broad truth of the place stands clear and undeniable. Here was wealth, and it was not shared equally. Here were some who had much and many who had little. Here, in the oldest gold on earth, gathered into a few graves among the many, is the plain evidence of a world that had grown unequal, divided into the high and the low. Whatever the particular meaning of each grave, the cemetery as a whole shows us a society sorted into rich and poor, and that sorting is the great change the metal brought. And there is a newer finding that drives the truth home, drawn from the very bones of the dead. For when the bones of the Varna people were studied closely in our own time, they revealed that the rich and the poor had not even eaten alike. Those buried with gold and treasure had fed better in life, on richer food, while those in the plainer graves had lived on humbler fare. The division was not only in the gold of the grave, but in the very flesh and bone, in what each had eaten across a lifetime. The inequality was real, lived, written into the bodies of the people. It was not a thing of show alone. So the Gold of Varna is not only a wonder of ancient craft, the oldest worked gold in the world. It is a record, the clearest we have, from so deep in time, of the birth of the divided world, of the moment when human beings who had lived for the whole of their story in rough equality began to sort themselves into the rich and the poor, the powerful and the powerless, the chief in his gold and the farmer in his field. It is the Copper Age laid bare, its splendour and its shadow together, gleaming in the graves by the sea. And then, like so much of this age, the people of Varna passed away, and their world ended. The great cemetery stopped being used, the splendour faded. Whatever it was that had made this small people so rich, so connected, so given to gold, it did not last, and in time they vanished from the land, leaving only their graves behind. Why their world ended, we do not fully know, as we do not fully know so much about them. But end it did, their gold lying buried and forgotten in the earth for 5,000 years, until a digging machine turned it up by chance in our own day. There is something fitting and something sad in that long forgetting. This people, who had gathered more gold than all the world beside, who had buried their chiefs as kings and their absent dead with faces of gold, lay utterly forgotten for the whole span of recorded history, unknown to every age that followed, their very existence a blank. The first goldsmiths of the world, the makers of the oldest treasure, slept nameless in the earth while every later civilization rose and fell above them, never knowing they had been there at all. Only now have we found them again. And so the people of Varna stand for the whole of this forgotten age, its wonder and its shadow gathered into one gleaming ground, the mastery of metal, the oldest gold on earth, the reach of trade, the shells from distant seas, and above all the great change, the birth of inequality, written in gold and bone, the few rich dead among the many poor. To see Varna is to see what the bright stone made, in its splendour and its division both. But every age must end and become another, and so must this one. Let us see now how the age of copper gave way at last to the age that followed, and the world became something new. Every age must end, and the age of copper ended as it had lived, slowly, and without anyone deciding it. There was no single day on which the Copper Age became something else. There was no great fall, no sudden death. There was only a slow change, spreading across the land over many lifetimes, as a new and better metal crept into the world, and, place by place, took the bright soft copper's throne. The forgotten age did not perish. It became the famous age that followed. It turned, by slow degrees, into the age of bronze. To understand how, you must remember the one great weakness of copper, the flaw that ran beneath all its wonder. Copper was soft, for all its gleam, for all the marvel of its making. A copper blade would bend, a copper edge would dull, a copper axe would lose its bite against hard wood. It was better than stone in many ways, and more beautiful, and it could be melted and remade. But it was not hard, and so it could not fully replace the stone tools for the heavy work of the world. The age was named for copper and stone together, because copper alone was not yet enough. And then, somewhere, by some accident we can only imagine, the answer was found. For copper is not the only metal in the rock, and sometimes the ore that the smith smelted held other things mixed within it. And when certain other metals found their way into the molten copper, whether by chance in the ore or by some smith's curious trial, a strange thing happened. The metal that came out was different. It was harder, it poured better, and held an edge longer, and made a stronger blade than copper had ever made. By accident, the smiths had found something better than copper. The secret, though they did not understand it as we do, was mixing, for the new and harder metal was not a pure thing like copper, but a blend, a marriage of copper with another metal mixed into it. Add a small measure of the right second metal to the molten copper, and the two together became something neither was alone, harder and tougher and finer than pure copper could ever be. This blending of metals to make a better one was a discovery as great as the first finding of copper itself, and from it the next age would take its name. The metal they made by this mixing we call bronze, and it was the making of a new world, for bronze had all the virtues of copper and few of its faults. It could be melted and cast into any shape, like copper. It could be melted down and remade, like copper. It gleamed, though with a different light. But unlike copper, it was hard. A bronze blade kept its edge. A bronze axe bit deep and did not bend. A bronze tool could do the heavy work that copper never could, and do it better than the finest stone. Here, at last, was a metal that could truly replace the stone. And that made all the difference, for it was bronze, not copper, that finally ended the long age of stone. As long as the only metal was soft copper, stone had kept its place, still doing the hard daily work of cutting and breaking. But bronze could do that work, and do it better, and so the stone tools that had served humankind since the very dawn began, at last, to be set aside. The axe of bronze replaced the axe of stone. The blade of bronze replaced the blade of flint. After 1,000,000 years and more, the age of stone was truly ending, and the age of metal had truly come. But bronze was harder to make than copper, and in that difficulty lay much of the shape of the age it brought. For copper could be had from a single ore, smelted in one fire. Bronze needed two metals, copper and the other was rarer than copper, found in fewer places still. The two had to be gotten separately, often from far apart, and brought together and mixed in the right measure by a knowing hand. To make bronze was to need a longer reach, a wider trade, a gathering of metals from distant sources. The new metal asked more of the world that made it, and so the coming of bronze drove the trade wider and the world tighter than ever. For if the second metal was rare, and found only in certain far places, then those who wanted bronze must reach those places, by trade or by other means. The roads of commerce stretched further, reaching across great distances to bring the rare metal to the copper, the two to be joined into bronze. The hunger for the new metal drove the peoples of the world into ever closer contact, ever longer trade, knitting the ancient world together more tightly in the search for the makings of bronze. It is worth seeing how the one age flowed into the other, with no sharp line between. The first bronze was likely made by accident, from ores that happened to hold the second metal mixed in, so that a smith made bronze without knowing how or why. Only slowly did the knowing come, the understanding that the mixing could be done on purpose. The right metals gathered and joined by design. For a long time, copper and bronze were made side by side, the old soft metal and the new hard one, until bronze proved itself the better and slowly won the world. The change was gradual, a tide, not a turning, and as bronze spread and proved its worth, the things that the Copper Age had begun grew greater still. The inequality deepened, for bronze was even more a thing of wealth and power than copper had been, and those who commanded it rose even higher above the rest. The weapons grew deadlier, for bronze made far better arms than soft copper, and war grew accordingly. The trade grew vaster, reaching for the rare metals across whole continents. Everything the Copper Age had started, the Bronze Age carried further, toward the first true kingdoms and the first cities and the dawn of written history itself. For it was in the Age of Bronze that the things we call civilization truly came into their own. The first great cities rose, and the first kingdoms, and the first kings who ruled them. Writing was invented, to keep the accounts of the gathered wealth and the growing power. And with writing, at last, history itself could begin to be recorded, the long silence of prehistory broken. All of this came in the Bronze Age, but all of it grew from seeds sown in the Age of Copper, in the first metal and the first smiths and the first gathering of wealth and power. Trade, So the Copper Age gave way to the Bronze Age, and in giving way, it gave its inheritance forward. The knowledge of metal, of smelting and casting and working the bright substance, passed from the one age to the next and grew. The trade, the gathered wealth, the rank and the power and the weapons all passed forward and grew greater. The Copper Age did not vanish when Bronze came. It became the Bronze Age, handing on all it had learned and begun, the foundation on which the famous age was built. The forgotten age flowed into the remembered one and was lost to view. And that, in the end, is much of why it was forgotten. For the Bronze Age was so much grander, so much more dazzling, with its cities and its kings and its written records, that it cast the humble Copper Age that came before it wholly into shadow. Who remembers the soft first metal when the hard one built empires? Who recalls the first small smiths when the Bronze Age raised civilizations? The Copper Age was eclipsed by its own offspring, outshone by the very age it had made possible, and so it slipped from memory, the quiet beginning behind the brilliant age that followed. But the beginning is not less important than what it begins. The Bronze Age built the cities, but the Copper Age found the metal that built them. The Bronze Age raised the kings, but the Copper Age first gathered the wealth and power that made kings possible. The Bronze Age wrote the first words, but the Copper Age first knit the world together in trade and need. Everything the famous age became, it became upon the foundation the forgotten age had laid. To honor the one without the other is to praise the building and forget that someone first had to lay the stone. So the age of copper passed into the age of bronze, and bronze into iron, and iron into all the ages of metal that followed, down to the steel and the wire and the bright machines of the world you live in tonight. And all of it, the whole long story of metal, began in that forgotten age, with the first bright stone drawn gleaming from the rock. We have followed that age from its dawn to its ending now, from the first gleam of copper to the coming of bronze. There remains only to gather up what it all has meant, and to carry it gently into sleep. Let us come, at last, to rest. So where does this leave us, at the end of our long night with the bright stone? We began with a question, the same question that opens every one of these journeys. What was life actually like in this age? Not the simple story, not the comfortable one, but the real one. And the answer, as you have seen, is richer and stranger than the forgetting would ever have led you to expect. This was no empty gap between the famous ages of stone and bronze. This was the hinge on which the whole metal world turned, lived by people as real and as remarkable as any who came before or after. Think back over the world we have walked through, the settled villages of the first farmers, standing among their fields beneath the rising smoke, into which the bright stone was born. The discovery of metal, that long, slow wonder, from the gleaming nugget cold-hammered, to the fire that softened it, to the smelting that freed it from the dull rock, to the casting that poured it into any shape. The smith at the heart of it, master of fire and ore, maker of wonders that seemed like magic to all who could not do what he did. A new thing in the world, and a new kind of person to work it. And think of the shining trade that the metal drove, reaching out across the land to knit the scattered peoples together, the copper travelling hundreds of miles from the hills that bore it, the shells and the gold and the knowledge flowing along the same roads, the world drawn tighter than it had ever been, the faint beginning of the connected world we know so well, born of the hunger for a bright, soft metal, the ancient roads of trade, the ancestors of every route that would ever cross the earth, first worn by people carrying copper. And think of the shadow that came with the wonder, for we did not look away from it, the metal that made some rich and others poor, deepening the gulf between people, gathering wealth into a few gleaming hands. The first weapons made to kill people rather than beasts, the dagger and the mace and the fighting axe, and the walls that rose around the villages against the coming raid. The frozen man in the mountains, struck down by enemies, and the gold of Varna gathered into a few graves among the many poor. The bright stone lifted humankind and divided it, in the very same motion. For that is the deepest truth of this age, the thing it has to teach. The metal was a bargain, as the farm had been before it, as every great change has been. It gave, and it took, in the same breath. It gave the gleaming wonder, the connected world, the foundation of all that followed. And it took the old rough equality of humankind and armed the hand for war and opened the gulf between the high and the low that has shadowed every age since. We cannot have the one without the other. The bright stone made the world we live in, its splendor and its division both, and we are the children of that making. And like the people of every age we have walked through, the people of the Copper Age did not know what they were beginning. No one set out to invent the metal world, or to found the long age of inequality, or to lay the ground for cities and kings and written history. They were only living, day by day, doing the sensible thing in the world they found, picking up the bright stone because it gleamed, working it because it could be worked, trading it because it was wanted, gathering it because it was wealth. The vast result grew from small and ordinary choices made by people only trying to live well. That is how the deepest changes have always come, as we have seen again and again across these nights. Not by grand design, but by ordinary people, living their ordinary lives, taking the sensible next step, and the one after that, until one day the world has become something it never was before. The first farmer did not dream of cities. The first settler did not dream of kings, and the first smith, drawing bright metal from the rock, did not dream of the steel towers and the bright machines that his small wonder would one day become. They simply lived, and in living, remade the world. And they were real people, not the dim and simple folk that the forgetting would make of them. They knew the wonder of the bright new metal, and the pride of the smith in his secret craft. They knew the wealth of the chief and the want of the poor farmer. They knew the fear of the raid and the grief of the killed, and the splendor of the gold laid in the grave. They loved their families, and feared their enemies, and buried their dead with care, some in gold and some in bare earth. They were human beings, as fully and completely as you are, living their one life in their one age. The mind that did all of this is your mind, the same as it was in the hunters of the ice and the farmers of the first villages, the same as it is in you tonight. The people who first drew metal from the rock were no less clever than we are, no less capable, no less alive to beauty and wealth and power and grief. They simply lived at the dawn of the metal world and met its newness with the same ingenuity our kind has always carried. There is no gulf between you and them, only the long, unbroken line of the generations, running from their fires to yours. And that line runs on, all the way down to you. For the metal world they began has never ended. It only grew, from copper to bronze, from bronze to iron, from iron to steel, and on to all the metals of the world you live in now. The wire that carries the light to your room, the frame of the building that shelters you, the machine on which you may be hearing these very words. All of it metal, all of it drawn from the rock by fire and knowing, all of it descended in an unbroken line from that first bright nugget, cold hammered by someone whose name is lost, in the dawn of the forgotten age. So when you next hold a thing of metal, some ordinary object you would never think to wonder at, remember where it began, not in a factory, not in a forge, but far further back, in the hands of the first person who saw the bright stone gleam and thought to work it, who put the green rock in the fire and drew out the shining drops, who poured the molten metal into the mold and lifted out the finished shape. Every metal thing in all the world is a child of that first wondering. We live, still, in the metal world that the forgotten age first made. And now the long story comes to its rest, as the day comes to its evening, and the fire on the smith's hearth burns down to embers. We have followed the bright stone from its first gleam to the coming of bronze, across the whole sweep of the forgotten age. The villages stand quiet now under the dark. The smith's furnace has cooled. The gold lies gleaming faintly in the graves by the sea. The bright thing of copper rests in the sleeping house. The age of the first metal has been told, from its dawn to its ending, and there is nothing left to do but rest. Let it settle now, the whole of it, the wonder and the shadow, the bright stone and the smith and the gold and the long trade. Let the forgotten age take its place at last in the story of your kind. No longer a gap, but a hinge. No longer empty, but full. The quiet beginning of the metal world you live in still. The people who made it asked nothing of you but to be remembered, and tonight you have remembered them, the first workers of metal, the makers of the oldest gold, the quiet bridge between the age of stone and the age of bronze. And now let yourself rest, as they rested, in the warm dark at the end of the day. There is nothing to hold on to, nothing to carry, nothing left to do but let the long story fade and the quiet gather. The bright stone has been drawn from the rock. The tale has been told. The forgotten age has been remembered. Let the warm dark close around you now, gentle as the glow of a banked fire, and let sleep come down as softly as the cooling of metal, slow and sure and deep. Rest well. The first metal gleams on, and the long story keeps, and the age is at its peace.